Welcome, Linda. Thanks for joining us today. Okay, I think I'll start getting going here. It's 10:06. This webinar is recorded, so if anyone wants to come back and take a second look or second listen, please let us know. And I believe we're going to post this on our website if I'm not mistaken. Um, so thank you to coming to our Hemp Growers Educational Series live webinar here Thursday, April 16th. Adam Trado and Sarah Hermes will be going through and discussing their areas of specialty. I'd like to introduce both speakers, if I may. So Adam Trado is Hempton Farms Vice President of Agriculture. Adam is a fourth generational farmer from Northeast Iowa and still churning dirt on the original farm homestead that his grandfather secured as an immigrant from Germany. After studying in France or finance at Iowa State, Adam went and studied abroad as an apprenticeship in Europe before returning to his family farm and joining John Deere in 2007. While at Deere, Adam held various positions in supply chain management. Excuse me. Oh, I'm sorry. If your microphone's on, if you could be sure to mute it. We're getting some background noise. So Adam at John Deere did supply chain management, product development, and operations. He left Deere in 2016 as the manager in material flow at Horicon, Wisconsin factory to focus on farming full time. With his background in operations and commercial agriculture, Adam joined Hempton Farms to focus on field scale production and various hemp crops, focusing on cost management to ensure profitability in a fast changing market. With a heavy focus on R&D in 2019, he enjoys sharing his lessons learned and collaborating with growers on agronomic advancements in hemp farming. We look forward to having a casual yet high review today with Adam. And again, when Adam takes the microphone, please ask questions. Hempton Farms is very excited to continue the partnership with Sarah Hermes with the risk management as a risk management consultant with Lockheed Companies in Kansas City. Sarah is actually a third generational landscaper and comes from tree farmers. Sarah studied landscape architecture at Cornell University. In addition to the love for nature and cultivation, she soon realized that her entrepreneurial family roots also gave her a deep appreciation for business. She then got her MBA at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, with a focus on risk management. She joined Lockton in 2016, which is the largest family-owned operated insurance broker in the world. As a risk management consultant at Lockton, Sarah serves as an advocate for her clients to minimize the risk, costs, and risk associated with their businesses. She has worked with many farmers and agribusinesses across the country, which led her to see a void in the marketplace for industrial hemp growers. Over the last 2 years, Sarah and her team have partnered with insurance carriers and hemp growers across the country to develop some of the first ever crop coverage solutions for hemp industry. She is passionate about supporting the business needs across the hemp supply chain to stand up for thriving, environmentally and socially conscious industry. Again, with Hempton Farms, we are so pleased to have Sarah as an advocate for those venturing into the hemp space. We have personally witnessed and experienced her desire to help anyone, regardless of the ask, regardless of the question. She is a resource meant to educate and partner with if you so choose to go down that path. So Sarah, thank you so much for coming today. Continue to partner, and I'll go ahead and turn over the microphone to you.
Thank you, Corey. Really appreciate that introduction and all of the work and organizing that has gone into putting this together. I think it's an incredible resource for a lot of different people. Can you all see my screen? Let's see. All right. So I am going to talk through and give a high-level overview of some insurance considerations for all of you looking to venture into the hemp industry. And the assumptions that I'm making are that most of you are on the growing cultivation side, and that there's probably a varying mix of experience and understanding of traditional insurance products for other lines, other crops. So I want to talk through both some property and casualty considerations, just really high level, as well as crop insurance specific. And again, this is really just an educational overview. So if you have any questions or follow-ups, happy to help and just be here as a resource, as Corey said. And I think my sense is that we're all on the same page here. We're just wanting to see this industry thrive. So please feel free to follow up. So real quick on property and casualty, for those of you that have a existing operation in place, my recommendation would be to at least reach out to your current broker and make sure that they know that you are entering into hemp related operations. There are increasingly carriers that are willing to write property and casualty insurance for operators of hemp. For a while, though, this was excluded on a lot of forms. And so just something to be aware of. The last thing I'd want is for you to be in a situation where you have some sort of claim and then the claim is denied because it's related to hemp operations or you have hemp on your farm and the carrier denies the claim. So our recommendation is just to be proactive with this and make sure that you're with an insurer and a carrier that does feel comfortable writing hemp. And as a general rule of thumb, the insurance industry as a whole is pretty archaic and data driven. And so that's where we're coming into some challenges with a new industry or a new crop like hemp. And so thus the delay for them to come to the table and provide normal solutions that they're providing for other types of crops and operations. And then the other item that I want to make note of is that there's quite a few parts of growing hemp and being in this industry that ultimately can't be transferred to an insurer, and therefore there's other risk controls that you need to take into consideration. So one of which is seed quality. And if you do a quick Google search on all of the litigation that's happened in this industry to date, there's a lot of people suing other people for poor seed quality or non-feminized seed or crops that go hot. And a lot of these items you're not going to be able to find insurance for. And so that's why it's really important to find quality partners in this industry and make sure that you're working with players that have a track record and have their own risk management protocols in place, and that you have contracts that are sound so that you're able to proceed without that type of risk. So moving on to crop insurance. It's taken a while for us to get to the point of having some good options available. So I'm going to talk through 4 different categories of crop insurance that are available this year. And likely this will evolve moving into next year, and we'll just continue to see more and more options become available. But the first big update for this year is this is the first year that the federal government, RMA, offered crop insurance to hemp farmers. This, however, was limited to somewhat of a pilot type of program, and so it really was not available across the board geographically. And so we'll see how that evolves going into next year. But there's 2 main categories for the federal crop insurance. First is a whole farm revenue protection, which I just want to touch on in case people are familiar with federal crop insurance. The whole farm revenue protection does cover hemp this year. It's a very complicated, it's a pretty complicated insurance product to apply for, and so you do want to make sure that you're with the right broker and um, or agent and see if this is a good fit for you. So you have to have more than 2 crops. You've got to have 3+ years of tax history on your farm. And if it is a good fit for you, it's a great product, but there's very few people that qualify. If you've got other specific questions on the whole farm revenue protection, happy to answer. The more commonly known and more commonly utilized is the multi-peril crop insurance, which is a yield protection product and similar to the crop insurance that you would normally get on any other crop, corn, soy, wheat, etc. So this was the first year again that this was offered. The application deadline this year was March 15th. And so we're past the deadline to apply this year, but I do want to make note of it because it's important if you are planning to grow this year and it's your first year, you're going to want to make sure that you adequately document and you're strategic about your planting plans for this year so that you can qualify for this product next year. So this is a federally subsidized insurance product. It's the most comprehensive that you'll be able to find since it does cover the full yield of the crop and protects against any sort of nature-related weather event, pest, disease, etc. This first year, it was only available in a limited number of states and in some cases a limited number of counties. So here's the map of where people were able to purchase this multi-peril crop insurance. The other prerequisite was that you had at least 1 year of growing history, which obviously in some states that was impossible. But that is why I highly recommend making sure that you're documenting and having the procedures in place so that you can qualify for this program next year. And then there's some other nuances state by state that mandate that you have to grow your hemp crop on a different plot of land than you did the year before, some stipulations around crop rotation, etc. So something to look into. Again, there's a lot of nuances state by state. Happy to answer any questions that come up. But again, this will likely become more widespread and available next year. It's a great product and definitely the first place to look for crop insurance. So moving forward into the private crop insurance sector, this really comes into play for growers where you don't qualify for the federal crop insurance or the limits of coverage are not adequate, that the value of your crop exceeds what the federal government is willing to offer you. And so everything I'm going to talk through here moving forward is available to growers regardless of where they are growing and regardless of the amount of experience that they have. So the first, and from my perspective, the most cost effective and efficient is a weather insurance bundle. So it covers your crop against hail, wind, fire, lightning, and smoke. And there's add-on coverage available for vandalism. So this insurance coverage, we can get up to $15 million for your particular farm location. And the rates for the limit is what I've seen range from about 2.5% to 8%. And so to put that to numbers, if you buy a $1 million policy for your farm, it's going to cost really conservatively about $80,000. But this is adjusted in the field. If you have a loss, you would file a claim. And again, outside of the federal crop insurance, I think that this is really a pretty good option. Again, happy to answer some more questions on that. For those of you that have a farming background, you might be familiar with Crop Hail, the private Crop Hail product. This is available by a number of different carriers and limits up to $10,000 per acre. Depends where you're located is what dictates the price, but in general, that's another option to look into if hail is a primary concern of yours. And then there are other types of insurance coverage that are called parametric coverage, and I won't get into a ton of detail, but these policies can be put in place for anything precipitation related or temperature related. So if you're worried about excess rain or drought or heat, there's some farmers and some um, stories of excess heat and drought can cause the crop to go hot if they don't have the correct genetics, etc. So there are some of these policies that can be purchased, and they are really just event specific triggered. So as an example, for excess rain, if you're concerned about that and you purchase one of these policies, if it rains more than, let's say, 3 inches in 48 hours, or whatever the parameters that we set, it would trigger the policy to pay out. And so it's just whether or not that event occurred or it didn't occur, and then you would get a payout. So this is a great option for early in the season for a washout, as we've seen last year. This policy could be triggered, and then you would immediately get payment that would allow you potentially to replant, as an example. So again, all of those private crop insurance products are available. And as a general rule of thumb moving forward, if we were able to have this conversation a number of weeks ago before the March 15th deadline, my first recommendation is to try to qualify for the federally subsidized insurance products. And so again, as best you can position yourself to qualify next year, highly recommend it. And then from there, it's exploring the private insurance products and trying to customize and build out the right type of insurance coverage for your particular farm and your particular needs. So I will pause here, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer. And this is my cell phone number if you want to give me a call or shoot me an email. But again, I'm really grateful to Corey and Adam and the whole Hempton team for putting this together, because I think education is really critical, and as much as we can information and wisdom share, the more successful that this industry will be moving forward.
Sarah, thank you. That's awesome. It's always educational, and I love your email, hemp at locked in. Keep it simple, so it's easy to contact you. We do have a question that came in on the chat line. The question is, who is your insurance carrier to offer this bundle?
Um, the weather insurance bundle,
Sure.
it's a specialty carrier that we helped develop the policy for. So it's a it's a domestic carrier, an A rated.
Excellent. Sarah, I've never been really accused of being a physicist here, so if you can kind of play along and kind of dummy it down for someone like me, is what's the process look like for me to get in contact with you if I'm a farmer? What do I need to have prepared, and what priorities should I have, knowing what you said about the deadline of March 15th? If I'm going to contact you, what's going to make that first call to you or to my current broker most beneficial?
That's a great question. So it depends on the product, but I would say um, for these private insurance products, it's really understanding, having the location of your farm laid out, knowing the um, whether you're seeding or transplanting clones, so the type of cultivation, knowing what your budget is, knowing what the value of the crop is, kind of having what is your ideal type of coverage in place, what are the perils that you're most concerned about, and then from there it's just talking through what options are available. And in most all of these cases, these all these insurance products are pretty much individually underwritten based on the location and size and value of that crop. And so it's really a case by case basis on what the premium and stipulations will be. But I think making sure that you've got all the basic information of what the cultivation strategy is for this year, then we can plug it in and get it to the underwriters and get you a quote back.
Excellent, excellent. Any other questions?
Yeah, Sarah, this is Adam. For the federal MPCI, would you have an example, or and maybe you can't do it on short ask, but because I know a lot of variables go into it, but would you have an example of, what a coverage per acre could be, either for biomass grown or for smokable hemp or smokable flower? Do you have just kind of rough ballpark of what you've seen with the estimates or quotes you're putting out?
Of what the limits are and the
Uh,
premium?
no, not the limits, but if you pay the premium, what the coverage would be. I think they, based on the number of pounds you anticipate to harvest times the price, and I think you get a coverage level.
Yeah. And I'm happy to, I guess the next time we run this, I'm happy to put in an example of that. It depends on the location. So I will say like, and it depends on whether or not it's direct seeded, whether it's transplant, whether you're growing for fiber versus oil, but whether it's organic or not, whether it's irrigated or not. So there's a lot of variables, and then add in the location. So like New Mexico as an example, the the rate of the coverage was over 10% or 13, 15%. So a million, they do it per acre, but let's say in total the policy was covering $1 million for a few hundred acres. It was going to be a pretty expensive policy, and that was with the subsidy. And then in other instances, it can be much less. That's not a very good answer to your question, Adam. And next time I can throw in an example of what a quote would look like, because that probably would be helpful.
Sure. Well, no, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot, and like you say, I understand there's a ton of variables into it. The only reason I ask that is, for the people on the phone, if you are on, kind of the verge of deciding whether to grow or not this year, even if you do an acre, I think it would be a wise move, because I think, maybe if Sarah comes back next week with some of those examples, some of the federally subsidized products are pretty attractive in terms of what they can offer per acre. And as a grower, that's a huge, tool in your financial tool set to limit your risk when you're a grower. So that's the only reason I asked, Sarah. Maybe it's something we can revisit next week when you present again. But again, I know we have found that where we're growing in other states, when we have the option for that federal MPCI, it's a huge asset as a grower. So just something I want people to keep in mind if they are on the verge of whether or not to grow this year.
For sure. And I will mention one other caveat, just because you said 1 acre. There are minimum acreage requirements for that product if you're growing for the federal, and then other minimums for the private. For the federal crop insurance, if you're growing for oil, I believe it's a 5 acre minimum.
Okay.
And then for grain or fiber, it's 20 acres. So again, there are a lot of nuances and requirements in order to qualify, but absolutely agree, Adam. In general, with very few exceptions, it's been a great option for all the farmers that we talked to this year.
And Sarah, if I remember correctly, I guess not to say you can't get crop insurance if you've never grown before, but if you do have a yield of production history, that's going to increase your coverage level, right? If you've got production history that exceeds what they call the county T yields, is that right?
Sorry, say that one more time.
If a grower has history, right? So if they've grown in a prior year, their coverage levels is calculated based on the previous yields. Is that correct?
In some cases, yes, we are able to factor that into what the average county T yields are for the MPCI. Yes.
Okay.
Which is again another reason why it's really important to document this year. Because assuming that you do have a good year, that will definitely help make it, get better coverage and better rates next year.
Gotcha. Perfect.
And then Jared has a question. Jared, I'm happy. Where can I find some additional marketing material on your hemp offerings? I'm happy to send you some more information if you want to shoot me an email at hemp@lockton.com.
And Jared stole my thunder a little bit there. This is Corey again. I was curious if you had a blog or you had maybe a industry specific resource that kicks out some pertinent information as it relates to crop insurance and specifically hemp crop insurance that can kind of keep people in know and let people know how the products are going and maybe what's planning. I know so many of us on the call here are being reactive to the federal guidelines that were set down late, and so many of the producers that I know often like at times to plan ahead. And so I didn't know if you had any resources out there, or maybe a slight poke to start a blog with your expertise.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great idea. Not something that I have currently, and I guess it's moved so quickly. It's been working with all the hemp farmers that I've had conversations with. I've just been keeping them up to date and reaching out when something has changed or something relevant to them comes up. So, great idea on the blog. I will definitely, with all of my quarantine time, give that some good thought.
Well, look forward to seeing that on Hempton Farms. So we'll work together on that. That sounds exciting. I love when new partnerships start.
Yeah, great idea.
We'll give a couple seconds here. Is there anyone else that has any questions that they feel they want to ask? If you're not able to get off mute, which is understandable, sometimes it sneaks away from us all, please put it in chat and we'll make sure to get you in contact with Sarah. And again, easy email to remember, hemp@lockton.com. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Sarah.
There you
On
go.
point, on cue.
Well, thank you again, Adam and Corey and the Hempton team. If there's any other questions that come up, let me know, and I'm happy to send these slides out or any other information that'd be helpful.
Without anything else, Adam, I think we move on to your presentation. If you got that queued up.
Absolutely.
Excellent. We'll take it away, friend.
Go ahead and share my screen. And Sarah, thank you again. And Corey, thank you for the introduction earlier in the presentation. Before I get too far, can everybody see my screen?
I can see it.
Perfect. So if this is your first time joining us, you may have missed some of these previous presentations that we had, but I just kind of want to recap. We kicked off this webinar series roughly a month ago with a presentation on policy on hemp production in Missouri by Alan Freeman. And we followed that up a week later in the next webinar with an economics discussion by Dr. Ray Massey from the University of Missouri. And then followed by an agronomics the week after that. And what we wanted to try and do, we did this last week and we want to do it again today, is kind of pull what we consider to be the vital few, especially if this is your first year growing, from those presentations. So if you did miss those presentations, they are available. I think they're online on our website, but if not, you can get in touch with myself or Corey at the end of this presentation and we can send you those copies. But as we look forward, or as you may be looking forward as a first year grower, in addition to what those presenters shared, one huge key to success we see in 2020 and beyond is aggressively managing your financials for your operation and your growth. So I'll talk more about that at the end and kind of show you a tool that we're using here at Hempton on our own farms and that we're also helping other growers with as they're looking at doing this year. So for us, any solid cropping plan really has to begin with field selection, and that's especially true when it comes to hemp. So the one thing you really want to take a look at is, first of all, what type of soil do you have? And when you think about soils, there's really three types that compose any type of soil, and that is clay, silt, and sand. Clay is going to be at one end of the spectrum. It's very fine. It's almost microscopic in grains, and that's why, you know, if you've ever rolled clay in your hand, it packs together very well because those small grains allow it to do that. That's great from a fertilizer holding capacity. Fertilizers won't migrate much through a clay soil, but what it's not great is allowing oxygen to reach the plants. So it's very tough and very difficult to grow something in just a purely clay-based soil. And then the opposite end of that spectrum is sand. From a microscopic perspective, sand is much larger than clay, almost 40 times in diameter compared to a clay particle. And what that allows is it does allow a plant to breathe and oxygen to reach the roots within the plant. But you know, counteractive to clay, nutrients move very quickly through sand. And somewhere in between the two of those is silt, which is a great crop producing agent. But the only problem with it is it's very susceptible to erosion. So when you're looking at soils or looking to where to grow your particular crop for 2020, what you want to try and find is a loamy soil. Loam is going to be kind of the perfect mix between those three things I just talked about. Generally, a loam is going to contain roughly 40% of sand and silt and about 20% of clay. And really for any of the crops out there, whether it's corn or hemp or soy, a loamy soil is always going to be what you want to try and target. So if you're trying to understand if you should grow on this field or that field or this section or that section, one great resource that we like to refer people to is the USDA Web Soil Survey. There are plenty of programs out there where you can pay for this exact same information, but this is provided free by the USDA. If you're computer savvy, it's very easy to go to the address or the link that we have on the slide here, type in your address or the field address, and then basically map the edge of the field with your mouse and understand exactly what soils you have on that particular piece of ground. Through an example on the right-hand side of the slide here. So, again, when I talk about loam or loamy soils, you're seeing really all four of those soils would benefit hemp production. Beyond soils, the other thing you really need to think about is drainage. Whether it's natural or artificial. If you get natural drainage, you may not need to introduce any artificial drainage, but if you have soils that are susceptible to ponding or anything like that, it might be key that you've got some level of field tile in that field to keep the water moving away from the plant and avoid drowning it out. And speaking out of the other corner of my mouth now, irrigation access. If you're on a very sandy soil where the water is going to move through very quickly, or the soil doesn't have much water retention capacity, you need to think about how you're going to irrigate that crop. So whether you're going to do it with an underground drip line system or an overground pivot, just things you need to be thinking about as you're selecting the field that you're planning to grow on. Soil fertility test. So once you picked out, hopefully a farm or a field with a loamy soil, we would advise that you get it tested for soil nutrients. Primarily what we're going to be looking for are the macronutrients, and those are associated with any crop. So nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Those are kind of the three main nutrients that people are typically going to look at when they're growing, and they're going to be key to your success. So when you take a fertility test, it's going to tell you what existing levels of phosphorus and potassium you have in that soil. And then using that, you can develop a fertility plan. Micronutrients, I've listed a couple of them there. There's more than that, but the primary ones that we're looking at when we're growing is sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, and then soil pH. So with hemp, you want to be somewhere between 6 to 7.5 on a soil pH perspective. If you're looking for resources on how to get your soils tested, I would recommend talking to your local extension office, or if you are in a rural community, any ag retailer is probably going to have a soil testing service, or they could refer you to one if they don't. Like I mentioned previously, so a fertility test then is going to drive the fertility plan for your crop. And just a couple of examples here. First of all, I'll mention that research and publications vary widely right now. There's not a gold standard, I would say, when it comes to fertilizing hemp. And to kind of help illustrate that, I threw a table at the bottom of this slide, and you see 6 or 7 different sources. And with those macronutrients that I talked about previously, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, you can see a pretty wide range of what these various studies are suggesting. So if you're curious what is recommended in your geographic region or regional area, again, I would recommend the local extension office. They'll likely have some recommendations for where you might be growing. If you're not having any luck with that, just a generic plan that we would recommend is 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre, 40 pounds of phosphorus, and 90 pounds of potassium. I did throw on 17 pounds of sulfur there. That's another pretty key nutrient, not just with hemp, but with all crops. Once you understand, again, your soils and your nutrient plan or your fertilizer plan, you need to think a little bit about your weed, pest, and disease plan. So right now, as most of you probably know, there are limited herbicides, pesticides, and fungicides labeled for hemp. So essentially, you're going to be growing it organically. Given that, the things that you need to be considering is weed pressure history on the field that you're looking at. So I wouldn't recommend planting on a field that you have a lot of weed pressure in prior cropping years. The prior crop is going to be key from a fungal perspective. So I don't remember if Sarah touched on this from an insurance perspective, but they will not insure hemp if it's being planted on a soybean field, and that's because hemp is very susceptible to the same funguses as soybeans. So be considerate of where you're putting it. Again, whether there's weeds, whether there was soybeans in the prior field, those are things you really need to think strongly about before you select that field. And then when it comes to planting, spacing, so again, because we don't have any herbicides labeled for hemp and we're growing it organically, we do have mechanical weed control options. But one thing you can help with is selecting your spacing correctly up front, so that you've got kind of the optimum mix between your inter-row spacing and your intra-row spacing. By inter-row, we mean, the distance between the rows of crops that you have, and then intra-row is within each row, how much space is between each plant. And if you can optimize that, you can help the field or that crop develop what we call a canopy much quicker. And once you have a canopy, it's going to naturally suppress the weeds that are trying to come up through from the soil from underneath. So just a couple of things to think about. I did talk about plant spacing again here. This is an eye chart, and we recognize that. But again, when you're talking about your row spacing, if you're in 60-inch rows, for example, we're going to recommend planting somewhere between 1,600 and 1,900 plants per acre. Again, that's going to get that canopy that we talked about a little bit earlier than some of the other spacings. It's going to be easier for you to work through your crop. Anything to the right of that, the yellow, we're comfortable with as well, because it's going to tighten up your plant's intra-row. The only thing you're not going to do is you're not going to be getting an equal amount of light to all crops, which is kind of what we're getting in this green band. But anything in the red band, we would stay away from. Inter-row weed cultivation is relatively easy with row crop cultivators, but when you start talking about intra-row weeding, that can get very, very complex. There aren't a whole lot of machines out there that do that effectively right now. So we're trying to stay away from that red piece that we talk about here. So these tools are all posted on our website. Just one of several things we want people to be thinking about as they're setting up to grow in 2020. And then putting all that together. So I mentioned that at the start of this presentation that we really need to aggressively manage the financials. I'm sure a lot of you are hearing about, downward price pressure on especially hemp biomass or CBD biomass. Still quite a bit of opportunity in smokable flower, but you really need to think strongly about all the costs that are going to this crop. Your agronomic plan and fine tuning that so you're not over fertilizing, for example, where you're only going to be wasting money. And then operationally making sure you're only buying, the size of equipment that you need to get the job done. You see an example of that on the right-hand side of the slide here, and I'm actually going to hop over to that tool that we use here at Hempton and talk people through it just a little bit. Before I do that, I should pause quickly. Do we have any questions either on the line, or has anybody dropped a note in the chat, Corey?
Not yet.
Okay. So don't be afraid to pipe up as we're going through this. There are a lot of numbers here, and we recognize that, and I'll try to walk through it slowly so everybody can understand. Right now, this particular model going across the top here, what we consider kind of the vital few. So right now, this model is analyzing roughly 14 or 1,500 acres. The costs based on the crops they're planning to plant is going to be about $2.4 million in total. We're forecasting a gross profit for this farm of 4.1 or a net profit of 1.7 million. If you have any inventory on hand, it's going to list that. Probably not something most of you folks on this call are interested in, but if you're talking to a banker and they're going to want to know what your current assets are in terms of crop assets and material assets, we'll list that there. And then any operating loans that you have on hand to produce your crop. So those 7 boxes up above, again, are kind of the vital few. And then down below here, we start to get into the nuts and bolts of everything rolling up into those numbers. I'm going to start by focusing on this crop performas and agronomic section. You'll see that there are 6 different crops that we've listed here: CBD biomass, CBD floral, hemp grain, hemp fiber, corn, and soy. We're doing that to kind of help people understand, where we see the returns on the investment for each of those respective crops. So for the sake of this example, I'm just going to walk down the CBD biomass column here that you see. Right now, this particular operation is planting 432 acres of biomass. On a per acre level, the machines that they are investing in are going to cost about $1,326. Machines are going to be anything from a tractor or a planter or a transplanter to drying equipment if you're investing in that, and potentially buildings and some other capital equipment as well. From a manpower perspective, that's going to be any unit overheads that you might have for salaried people that you have on your farm, or if you're hiring seasonal labor. Seasonal labor definitely comes into play, especially more on the labor intensive floral side. So you see a big cost difference per acre between manpower for biomass and manpower for floral. And that's because there's a lot of hand labor associated with hanging and drying floral and transplanting it and that type of thing. From a material perspective, on the biomass side of things, that's primarily going to be your fertilizers. If you're using plastic with, some of the higher grade Norseman planters or something like that, that's going to roll into here as well. Again, you see a big jump in the costs on material between biomass and CBD floral. That's because, at least in this model, they are using plastic mulch beds for the floral and also drip tape, and those 2 components are very expensive. So the fertilizer cost between these 2 isn't really going to change a whole lot. We're not going to do anything much different between those 2, but what the plastics is going to take to grow the floral is where you see the big cost jump. And then miscellaneous, that's going to be anything from land costs, whether you rent it or whether you're purchasing it and making payments on it, to any testing that you're having to do for the hemp field, any operating interest that you're paying through the course of the growing season, to really roll that all up. So that gives us our total costs. One thing that we're monitoring, at least with this grower, is the percent that is quoted. That's, again, really for your banker more than anything. If they want to know how strong your financial model is, they can look at that particular item. And obviously, the higher, the closer you are to 100% quoted, the happier your financiers are going to be. Then we get down to production revenue. So the yield that we're estimating. So we typically advise or coach growers through the season and going out into their field and looking for different signs that they can kind of use to help calculate or forecast what they might yield at the end of the year. Right now on the library of farms, I guess this model is looking at, they're forecasting about 2,300 pounds of biomass. That would primarily, at this point in the year, because the seed isn't even in the ground yet, just be based on historical yields for those farms or those fields. As you move through the season and you start to understand more about plant populations or just the general health of the plant, there are some things that we can do somewhat subjectively, but things that we can do to kind of help us estimate or fine tune what that actual yield might be at the end of the year. And then, of course, as they're harvesting the crop at the tail end of the year, we're recording that data as well, and then feeding this tool to see what the actual yield was by year end. So contracted and uncontracted units and pricing, obviously anything that you can do to lock in a price at a profit earlier in the year is better. So, we constantly want to be managing how many units, or in the case of biomass, how many pounds we've contracted. And then what the price would be. Right now, this particular grower doesn't have anything contracted on the biomass. which basically results in his entire forecasted yield of 2,300 pounds that we're just pricing at this point at the current market rate of $3 per pound. I'll mention that when I say $3 per pound, if you actually go out and look at spot pricing on the biomass indexes, probably closer to 40 or 50 cents per point per pound. But we're forecasting for this model 10%, or excuse me, 6% CBD at 50 cents a pound is what they can expect to gather at harvest time in October with this crop. So it gives you your gross income of $7,100 for this particular example, or a net profit per acre of $2,574. We shared that because, again, there's a lot of talk of downward price pressure in the biomass industry, and that's true. It's there. But if you aggressively manage the costs that we talked about up here, and if you understand what you can net for it at the end of the season, the returns are still very attractive relative to, maybe some of the traditional crops that were grown here in Iowa, like corn and soy. So right now, as some of you may be aware, corn and soy prices are getting hammered pretty hard. And a lot of farmers on the corn and soy are actually going to the fields this fall, or this spring, excuse me, anticipating losses if they hadn't previously contracted some of that crop. So the ROIs, or from an ROI perspective, we still feel that hemp, whether it's biomass or floral, is still very attractive if you're a grower. We get into some other kind of financial metrics down here, helping you understand what your break-even price needs to be. So again, right now we're forecasting $3 on that point per pound basis. That could drop all the way to $1.92, and you could still break even, or at least recover the cost that you've invested up here. Same on the yield side of things, we're calculating a break-even yield. So, if you do have a catastrophic year, whether it's just, first year grower issues or weather issues that are out of your control or that type of thing, what's the minimum yield that you could accept before you'd start to lose money? If you have yield data, that's going to populate here, and then insurance coverage. So again, part of the reason we keep getting Sarah on the phone or on this presentation is that is such a huge piece, or financial piece, that you can use to manage your risk on any farm or on any crop. So like I mentioned earlier, if you are on the verge of whether or not to plant hemp this year and you haven't done it yet, I would strongly encourage just an acre. Because if you do that, you can actually use the production history off that acre. The insurance companies are going to combine that with what they call the county T yields and basically do a 5-year average, but T yields generally aren't very favorable to a grower. So if you can combine that with some actual history, it's going to up the coverage level that you could get right here. So you see here, we don't have any insurance factored in. That's because some of this is going to be grown in Iowa where we can't get insurance this year. From a net profit minimum then, so again, because there's no insurance coverage, we don't really have a floor, so we run the risk of essentially losing the entire investment here if we have a catastrophic year. But then from a net profit maximum, right now they're forecasting maximum yield, which would net about $2,500 an acre. Before I drop down into this section, any questions on any of these numbers I've shared here so far? I should mention that, the machine, the manpower, the material, really all of these things, we consider this kind of a dashboard summary for a grower. Obviously, there's a whole lot rolling into that. So we're not just throwing a random dart at a number board and coming up with 1326. There's various tables feeding that. So if we want to drill down into the details, we can do that. So then fertility. So again, I talked about, once you have your soil tests and your fertility plans, making sure that you have a fertilizer plan that's going to feed that crop through the course of the season. And what we really want to do is make sure that we're putting on enough NP and K especially. And so if you worked with fertilizers, you understand this a little bit, but each fertilizer that you buy or that you apply is probably going to have varying compositions of that NP and K. So 18460 DAP fertilizer, for example, combined with 32% fertilizer combined with 0060 potash, that can be very confusing if you've never actually, it's simple math, but if you're not used to doing it, can be very confusing. So all we're doing here is really analyzing all those fertilizers that you're planning to apply to your given field, and then making sure that you're getting the levels that we feel are adequate for the crop. So Right now this model, in my opinion, is probably under forecasting a little bit in terms of nitrogen. If you recall my slide previously, we said about 150 pounds of N is what we would recommend. Um, from a P&K perspective, this one's going a little light as well. So obviously, if we increase that, that's going to increase our material costs up here. So we probably have some work here to do, to ensure that we've got the right level of nutrients on there and that we can still be profitable at those increased applications. This next section, capacity planning and execution, if this is something that people want help with, we're happy to talk through it. It does take a fair amount of time relative to, this section over here. I won't go through this in too much detail today, but what I will say is to us, it's all about what we would call right sizing. So, I think a good example here is the equipment that they're planning for application, whether it's fertilizer applications or some level of herbicide or pesticide. The machine that this operation is planning is capable of doing 22,000 acres per year, and they only have demand for 3,500 acres. So in that case, we'd probably advise the grower, look, instead of investing in this thing, if you don't already own it, maybe just think about reaching out to your local co-op or local ag retailer to see if they're willing to custom apply that, and save some money by renting it as opposed to investing in it from a capital perspective. But really trying to balance, the planned acres that you have for that particular product or machine against the demand that you have for it. Very similar concept on the manpower side of things. And you can start to see, when I talked about transplanting, or excuse me, the CBD floral, you start to incur a lot of labor costs from a transplanting perspective or from a harvest perspective. So you see some of those numbers and manpower hours that are going to be required showing through here. Again, what's planned, what's actually installed, and then what the demand is for that particular product or that particular machine. Again, these last sections here, material planning and execution, very few people that we work with utilize this. They have their own way of tracking how much materials they have on hand. This is essentially just a summary of some inventory tracking tables. And then from a cash flow perspective, so when you're putting it all together and trying to understand, maybe where you're going to be short on cash or if you're going to need an infusion of capital, either to buy your inputs or machines or whatever, it's going to show down here as well, so you understand what your overall cash flow is kind of month by month until the end of the year when you sell your crop. So I recognize this is a lot to digest. While people think of questions, or if you have any questions, again, this is a tool that at Hempton we are offering because you can make decent money growing hemp, but you can also lose a lot of money. So we want to make sure that if people are purchasing our seeds or whatnot, that they have a sound financial plan to actually make some money at the end of the year. It's a fun crop to grow, but no crops are very much fun if you're losing money growing them. So we just want to make sure that people understand kind of what they're getting into before they get too far ahead of themselves. Certainly not something you have to use. If you have your own spreadsheets or pro formas that you'd like us to take a peek at and poke holes through, we're happy to do that too. But just wanted to share this today so that folks on the phone are aware that this is a tool that you can use through Hempton as a grower. Moving on from there, I want to talk just a little bit about our genetics. So genetic placement is probably the one thing that I haven't really talked about up until now. It's going to be another key for success. I'll run through 7 genetics that we have this year that just at a very high level where I think they might be a good fit. Starting with the moneymaker. So from a genetic history perspective, if you will, that's one of our newer genetics or varieties. It's in about the 2nd generation from a breeding perspective. Probably a little younger or less established than we'd like it to be. But we are excited about that one because it is CBG dominant. And if you're close to the industry, you probably understand that there are some market opportunities if you're growing CBG. So we're putting it up there, and we're recommending that for people that maybe have some experience growing CBD. But I do want to caution people because that genetic isn't quite as stable yet because it's relatively young from a breeding perspective. Not to say you can't have success with it, but it's going to take a lot of in-season management as you react to, fertilizer needs or any pest needs or issues or anything like that. So just something to keep in mind. So like anything in this world, the risk to reward ratio, probably going to be a little more risk in this particular variety, but with where CBG is at right now, maybe a little more reward on the back end of the season when you go to sell it. The rest of our genetics, I'll walk through. I will say the rest of our CBD genetics are all in their 7th or 8th generation of breeding. So when I talk about stability, these are a lot more stable. The one thing you need to think about is kind of where you're growing and making sure you're selecting a genetic that is fit for your regional. The El Jefe, typically we would recommend for a warmer or arid climate. So we've had a lot of success with this one in New Mexico. We're going to be growing this on a small farm we have north of Vegas this year. Obviously, those are 2 pretty hot and dry climates, but this one we feel is pretty well placed for those climates. In addition to that, tends to work a little bit better on a sandier soil. So something to think about if you are growing in sandier soils. The sour tea and the trophy wife, as well as the berry blossom and the Merlot 2, excuse me, those I would say are a little more geared towards our Midwestern climates and soils. From a climate perspective, those are all going to do better in a warmer and a humid climate. So that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, with humidity, you start to see some stress from a fungal perspective and things like that. So, we see a little bit of resistance to that with these varieties, which is why we try to place them in the Midwest if people are interested. From a soils perspective, again, going back to what I said earlier, if you can place these on a loamy soil, that's where we're going to see the most success with these. And, if that isn't making sense, or if you're not familiar with that, wherever you're growing your best corn is where you're probably going to grow the best of these varieties. So keep that in mind as you're placing your seed on your soils. And then the last one, the autopilot, this one's pretty flexible. It's probably, got more history in terms of genetic breeding than some of our other varieties. And so it's pretty stable on just about all soil types. And it does well in both humid and dry climates. Probably not going to see the yield necessarily on the autopilot that you might see on some of the others. So something to keep in mind, but you may not have some of the in-season issues that you might face with some of the other ones. So the autopilot's kind of more the middle of the road. If you're a first-year grower, it's something that we might recommend trying. But all that being said, all this comes down to one-on-one conversations, either with myself or Corey or Morgan or anybody else on our sales team. We're happy to have those conversations because, again, it is critical that you get the right genetic on your field if you want to succeed. Pricing perspective listed out here, and I won't go through all of this right now, but we will send this out after if anybody has questions on pricing. I guess if they do have questions, we can talk about it here, but we'll be sending that out after this presentation, and you can dig into this in a little more detail. Any questions on anything that I've shared today, whether it's some of the earlier slides or the financial planning or the genetic placement or anything that's come up as we've been moving through this? If not, just a reminder, we do have several service area hub locations. So depending on where you might be calling in or planning on growing, you can see the 7 different locations that we have there. Typically that's where we're going to distribute our seed and or clones out of. So something to keep in mind if you're closer to one of those locales, we can get you seed a little bit quicker. That is all I have. Again, my name's Adam Trado. I've got my email and my phone number on this slide here. We'll be sending that out. So if you do have any questions, and whether they come up after the call or later this week, you're welcome to contact me at either of those places. Corey, is there anything that you wanted to share that maybe I missed or grazed over?
Do you want to go back up to the price catalog? Just want to touch on that these are per seed price. I know it says quantity 5,000, but a lot of people are used to seeing seeds in pounds. We are able to mix and match these. I know some folks want to do their own R&D on their ground this year. So you are able to mix and match. We do take check and ACH payments for these, just the nitty gritty of it. If there's anyone, like you said, Adam, that wants to continue to have the discussion, you of course have your information, and we're able to carry on that conversation. As said in many conference calls before, I think our main goal is partnership in the terms of collaborative learning from each other and really trying to figure out what are the best strategies and systems of operations as we go forward. So, Adam, I'll hand it back to you if you have any closing comments.
No, nothing really to add other than, I'll stick around. I typically do for 5 minutes after this call. So if anybody wants to stick around and ask me any questions, I'll be here till probably 11:10. Again, otherwise you've got my contact info here and happy to answer questions at any time. With that, I'll wrap it up. Thanks everybody for calling in today and look forward to hearing from you and speaking with you.
The floor is still available if there's any questions.
This conference will now be recorded.